The surf and sand of Central Florida make this a popular vacation spot. But the area lost some of its luster in 1995 when a serial killer set up shop. After the fourth body was discovered, police knew an important detail about the killer. He had an unusual dog with an unusual drug habit. Tampa, Florida is known not only as a tourist destination, but it also has more thunderstorms than any other location in the United States. The name Tampa is derived from the Calusa Native American word meaning lightning. Along with the tourism, there's prostitution. On October 20th, 1995, a pizza delivery driver discovered the nude body of a white woman in nearby Clearwater. 42-year-old Wendy Evans was a crack cocaine addict recently released from a mental health clinic. She was last seen hitchhiking in an area frequented by prostitutes. Wendy had been beaten and strangled, but there were no signs of sexual assault. The body had been dumped, meaning she had been killed elsewhere. Not surprisingly, a thunderstorm washed away possible evidence.
All the small artifacts that we would ordinarily hope to find on someone with clothing on, but we were doubtful we were going to get too much. So we were going to have to use anything and everything at our disposal, from microscopic examination to the use of light energy to try to luminesce microscopic materials that our eyes could not see.
Investigators used a Lumilight to examine the body. This device uses high-intensity light, higher than sunlight, which causes man-made fibers to glow or luminesce.
We found
no significant evidence was recovered. In the fall of 1995, police in Clearwater, Florida had 3 murdered women, their nude bodies dumped in deserted locations. With the passage of time between these 3 murders, police knew they were dealing with a killer who lived in the area and not a tourist. Serial killers tend to hunt for victims close to where they work or live. Although the victims were nude, the killer left behind some clues.
It was a tire that I had designed when I was at Firestone.
We had no idea that he was the designer of the tire we were looking for. So that was just a very lucky break for us also.
The tire was a Firestone Radial ATX, last manufactured in 1992. These were aftermarket replacement tires used on small pickup trucks and sports utility vehicles. Police researched sales records on how many of these tires were shipped and sold in Florida. And they got a break. The ATX was not a best-selling model. And only one dealership in the entire state of Florida had sold the ATX tires in the last 12 months.
Tire tracks can be a very valuable bit of evidence at a crime scene.
One set was purchased by a woman living in Clearwater, just a few miles from where the bodies were discovered. And she also owned a dog. Florida investigators were on the hunt for a serial killer known to be driving a vehicle with Firestone Radial ATX tires. Police discovered that a woman living in the area, Terry Jo Howard, purchased a pair of Firestone Radial ATX tires a few months before the murders began. Terry Jo lived with a boyfriend, 41-year-old James Randall.
We went to their Belcher Road address at night, and we had a detective sneak up on the vehicle and identified the tires on the vehicle as being the Firestone Radial ATX tires that Peter McDonald said they were.
Terry Joe was a recovering drug addict and a former prostitute. James Randall was a construction worker. Terry Joe also had a dog, a pug, that she would walk in the neighborhood. Local prostitutes identified Randall as a regular customer. Police surveillance teams followed Randall for days and followed him into a car dealership, driving the vehicle with the Firestone Radial ATX tires.
Not wanting to give away anything, the officer following stayed in the background, and the dealer took the 2 tires off and replaced them. Then the detective called me all excited. He said, "Pete, we've got the 2 rear tires."
But investigators needed all 4 tires to get a proper match. So police devised a ruse. Posing as an employee from the tire dealership, a police detective told Randall that his new tires were defective. But if he brought his car in right away, he'd receive 4 brand new tires for free as a gift for his inconvenience.
That same afternoon, Terry Jo Howard showed up with James Randall and gave her 4 brand new tires that the sheriff's office had purchased.
And the new tires placed on Randall's vehicle were marked.
We marked them in a certain way so that if those tires showed up at one of our crime scenes in the future, we would know for sure that they were the tires from James Randall's truck.
Peter McDonald studied the 4 original tires from Randall's vehicle. Tires have a feature called sipes, small cuts in the tread that grab the road in an effort to prevent hydroplaning. The molding process creates marks in these sipes, marks that can distinguish one tire from another. The sipes from James Randall's tire matched those from the crime scene photos. And so did one other distinguishing feature.
I found that the right rear tire, as chance would have it, was the best photographed tire, and there was a stone that was held in the groove in exactly the same location that was recorded at the crime scene. The stone being held in the tire allowed for a positive identification.
But police wanted as much evidence as they could gather, and they wanted to examine the hair of the pug owned by Terry Jo Howard. Fled the state of Massachusetts after serving 6 years in prison for twice raping his first wife.
James Randall has been identified as a sexual sadist, and that is a person who has to inflict pain on his sexual partner in order to obtain sexual gratification for himself.
Terry Jo Howard described Randall the same way.
He got really mad at me, and I sat down in a chair, and he was yelling at me, and he came over and he picked me up by my throat and pinned me up against the wall. That was the last thing I remembered until I woke up on the bed, and he was on top of me having intercourse with what I believe he thought was my dead body.
Inside of their apartment, police found more forensic evidence, more proof that the murders were committed here.
I never felt so betrayed in my whole life. And he was a master manipulator. When they told me that they thought that Jimmy was the one that was killing all the girls in the area, I was so shocked. I just started screaming.
James Randall and Terry Jo Howard were living together during the time police suspected Randall was killing Clearwater prostitutes.
I think he liked the life he lived with me. It was a clean, good life. I don't think either one of us had ever lived life that good in our previously. Dinner waiting at home, someone who cared about you, someone to go to the movies with, someone to chat with, someone to watch TV with.
Armed with a search warrant, investigators discovered a pink throw rug under the couple's bed. Scientific tests found that the main portion of the rug was nylon. The fringe was polyester. The fibers were triangular in shape, and the dye was the same as Remember the cigarette paper found on Cindy Pugh's body that contained saliva? The DNA from that saliva belonged to Terry Jo Howard. Proof the cigarette paper had come from inside their apartment.
We believe that it was one small piece of a cigarette butt that the dog had chewed up and left behind that was attached to Cindy Pugh's breast, unbeknownst to James Randall, which was a major, major piece of physical evidence.
I believe some of these murders happened in my home, in my bed. I know some of them did. 2 of them did. I was over here in West Palm visiting my sick and dying.
Tire impression in the sand. Terry Jo confronted Randall about all of this when she went to see him in prison.
I just kind of looked at him and said, "Why not me? Huh?"
With my shoelace. At this point,
Becoming a good cattleman is buying the right cattle at the right price. In the 1980s, one cattleman in Missouri had a unique talent for choosing the very best cattle and paying very little for it. Some of his farmhands, however, paid a very steep price. Chillicothe, Missouri, the local barbershop is still the place to hear news and swap stories and even pick a few tunes. It is also the place where farmers still make a living raising cattle and selling them at auction. In the late 1980s, cattle auction houses throughout the state were being swindled. Buyers, who were mostly drifters and transients, would show up, make their purchase, pay by check, and then disappear. The checks were inevitably worthless.
It was odd that several of them would have checks, and then when we went to look for them, we couldn't find them. We'd enter them into the computer, but they never showed up.
Many of the buyers had at some point worked on this farm in Moorestown, just outside of Chillicothe. The farm was owned by 78-year-old Ray Copeland and his wife, Fay.
They appeared to be just an elderly farm couple that were kind of shy and didn't mix much with the people, but never knew of them, causing any problem here.
The small farm wasn't enough to support the Copelands. Fay also worked in a factory and later as a motel maid.
We were just everyday people. And I was taught from childhood on, when you were married, you stayed with them. The husband was the boss, and he was the boss.
But it was a hard life, and the family was poor.
The only shoes we ever had was school shoes, too. And you'd have to go out there milking the cows barefooted, and this was included in the wintertime.
When the Copeland children left the farm to pursue their own dreams, Ray looked for farmhands to help work the farm. He was up in age, hard of hearing, and wasn't a great businessman.
Because Ray could not read or write. And with bookkeeping, writing names down where they were at, things like this, he needed somebody to write them down.
To find workers, Ray would go to local homeless missions.
Just ask people if they'd like to go out, make some money and, get paid at the end of the day, or, we can help you get some finances started. And they go out, get people and help them get an account started, in a bank.
These men were usually on the run themselves. Many had addictions, family problems, or suffered from mental illness. Most had been arrested for vagrancy, petty theft, or similar offenses. Ray Copeland paid them $50 a day for their labor and also provided room and board.
One of these men who was offered that kind of money and a place to live, especially maybe in a country setting, why, it would be paradise. It would be something, it would be a dream come true for a man like that.
One of the men wanted in connection with writing bad checks to cattle auction houses was 27-year-old Dennis Murphy, a drifter from Illinois who for a time had worked for Ray Copeland.
There's a sheriff at the door. He's got questions.
In 1986, a sheriff's deputy asked Ray Copeland if he knew Murphy's whereabouts. Copeland said Murphy simply took off one day.
He just took off in the middle of the night. Haven't seen him since.
They would leave in the middle of the night, and he didn't know where they went. He said, there again, he said, you know how transits are. They're here today and gone tomorrow, and they would just leave.
I understand it, Dennis Murphy.
When Copeland was told Murphy was a thief, he wasn't surprised because he had been swindled too.
No, I don't.
We're looking for him. He wrote some bad checks.
I know. He wrote one to me. I said, dude, it's in that drawer. Here you are.
Copeland also had a check from Murphy which had bounced because of insufficient funds. In addition to Murphy, 7 other men were wanted in connection with the cattle auction check scam. None could be located until police received a call from Nebraska. The informant said he knew where Murphy and the other transients had gone. There were 8 men wanted for writing bad checks to cattle auction houses in central Missouri. All had disappeared from the area without a trace. Then police got a telephone call from Jack McCormick, a drifter and small-time con man who at one time had worked on Ray Copeland's farm.
He was a transient. He moved a lot, and he had a lot of stories, and I think he liked to tell a lot of stories.
McCormick said he thought he saw some human bones, including a skull, on the Copeland farm. The farm covered 40 acres, including a pond, a barn, fields, and woods. County deputies, Chillicothe Police, the State Highway Patrol, and the county coroner all searched the area.
Surveying the property and looking for possible burial sites on the property and possible places where the deaths actually took place.
And we had search dogs, backhoes, and we'd punched a lot of holes around in the farm, and we had really searched this farm, hadn't found a thing, so, you know, you always think, well, maybe this didn't happen.
After 9 days of searching without success, they brought Jack McCormick to the scene.
I asked him, I said, Jack, just point to where these bodies, or where this skull and leg bone was. And he got outside there, kind of beside the barn, looking off down through the pasture, and finally he said, well, really, he said, I didn't see any. He said it could have probably been a dishpan or something down there.
But a look into Copeland's background showed an interesting coincidence. 20 years earlier, he had been arrested numerous times for the same thing, writing bad checks.
Every time he'd get arrested, he would call me to come and bail him out. I bailed him out of jail quite a few times.
About every 18 months seemed like his police out there and him being gone for a while. It was common for us as growing up.
But Ray appeared to have settled down because there had been no arrests in the 20 years since. And he had never been arrested for any violent crime. Police soon learned that Copeland worked on some other farms in the area to earn extra money. One was a farm just a few miles away. In the barn, where Copeland worked storing bales of hay, police discovered a shallow grave and the badly decomposed bodies of 3 men lined up head to toe. They had probably been there for 2 or 3 years and were unrecognizable.
They were just wrapped in blankets and in an earthen grave is what they were. In this situation, they were in some clay ground, which tends to kind of ward off decomposition because the air and doesn't get to it as quickly as it was in, say, a different type of soil.
The 3 men had been killed by a gunshot wound to the head. But there was no evidence linking Ray Copeland or anyone else to the crimes. A few days later, in another nearby barn on the same property, police removed hundreds of bales of hay, and under a floorboard was another body. 6 weeks later, in a nearby well was yet another body. The man was wearing a belt which said Dennis. But was this Dennis Murphy? And was the killer Ray Copeland?
Why would he do something like that? When we had everything paid for, we didn't owe for nothing. We had the truck paid for, everything, all the machinery and all, farm and everything. Why would he turn around and do something like that if he didn't?
The bodies of 5 men had been recovered from a farm in Missouri. Jack McCormick, a former employee of Ray Copeland's farm, told police that Copeland was running a check fraud scam. He said Copeland gave him a few $100s to open a checking account and told him to use a post office box as his address. Copeland then took McCormick to cattle auctions and sat in the stands, signaling McCormick when to bid on cattle. When he won the bidding, McCormick would pay for the cattle with a check.
And sometimes the check would clear, and then they would kind of have a standing at the sale barn. They'd go back the next time and write a larger check with the pretense that he would make the check good. But the check then, when it got to the bank, didn't clear.
Copeland sold the cattle bought in McCormick's name. And before the check had time to bounce, Copeland confronted McCormick with a gun.
Ray had the pretense of a coon being down in a hole there in the barn.
There's a coon around here that's driving me nuts. I think he's in that hole there. Kind of sticking down there.
And he wanted Jack to get down with a stick and poke it out of the hole. And Jack said when he got down there, he said he was already kind of scared of Ray. But when he got down there, he said he wouldn't take his eyes off of Ray. He kept looking up at him because Ray had the .22 rifle and supposedly was going to shoot the coon when he poked it out of the hole.
I'll get a good shot at him. Come on, keep trying. He'll come out. He'll come out. Yeah, he'll come right out. I'll show you.
Jack said he looked up real fast, and then when he looked back, Ray had the rifle pointed at him.
McCormick said he talked Copeland out of shooting him. He promised Copeland he would leave the area and never come back. McCormick fled Missouri and for 5 months kept quiet because he feared Copeland would kill him if he ever told anybody about the scam. When investigators searched the Copeland's home, they discovered an old .22 caliber rifle and a full assortment of men's clothing, none of which belonged to Ray Copeland.
Clothes from several different people, but different sizes, shoes, suitcases. There was numerous suitcases in the house. None of it belonged to this family, or these clothes wouldn't fit Ray or Faye Copeland.
And hidden in a camera case was a list of men hired by Ray Copeland to work on the farm. 4 of the names were marked with an X, which corresponded to the 4 who were wanted in connection with passing bad checks. Investigators sent the skulls of the victims to Dr. Ronald Geyer, a forensic odontologist. Dr. Geyer photographed the skulls. He performed a dental examination and took x-rays and created a transparent dental chart for each body.
And so you make a chart of everything you find in the pre-mortem records to match to the post-mortem records.
In this case, the pre-mortem records posed a challenge.
Some of them are kind of sketchy and old, and the biggest problem was that the records were old, and these people had not had dental treatment in the period of time from the time the records were made up to the time of their death.
Some of the transients' records were almost 30 years old, and the skulls were missing many teeth, which complicated the comparison.
And then it got down to the point, I think, in some of them we had to look at the bone patterns. And I remember one of them had a condyle, the joint in the jaw right up here, that the condyle was misshapen.
That matched a panoramic dental x-ray belonging to Dennis Murphy, positively identifying the body found in the well. By comparing pre- and post-mortem dental charts, Dr. Geyer identified the other 4 bodies as Wayne Warner, Paul Cowart, Jimmy Dale Harvey, and John Freeman. Cowart, Harvey, and Freeman were 3 of the 4 names on the Copeland list marked with an X. Coroner Scott Lindley performed autopsies on all of the bodies and discovered that the cause of death in each case was a gunshot wound to the head from a small caliber gun shot at close range.
If it's at close range, the inside layer of the skull tends to break away or flake away, and there's more cracking and damage to the skull.
And inside the skulls, Lindley found bullets and bullet fragments. Ballistics tests revealed that the lands and grooves on those fragments matched the lands and grooves from Ray Copeland's .22 caliber rifle. Police arrested Ray Copeland as well as the person they believed was his partner in crime.
What surprised me more than anything else was them actually arresting Mom for the same thing.
But what role did 68-year-old Fay Copeland play in the murders? Ray Copeland was arrested and charged with the murder of 5 men in what was believed to be a modern-day cattle rustling scheme. They also arrested his wife, Fay.
But I was not with him when he done his bad deeds. I knew nothing about it, and it didn't include me.
While in prison, Fay wrote a letter to her husband assuring him that things would cool down soon. Fay's handwriting matched the handwriting on the list of the missing men. But Fay denied any knowledge of the murders.
I asked no questions. Wouldn't have done me any good if I had him, because he'd have slapped me across the house.
Ray Copeland's long history of violence had previously been hidden from everyone but the Copeland family.
There was one time one of my brothers was scraping the bottom of his bowl that had oatmeal. He didn't like the sound, took a frying pan to him. Myself personally, milking cows, the old cow kicked the bucket over, he took a pair of metal cow kickers and beat me with it for no reason. That was an everyday occurrence with him.
Fay and Ray Copeland were each tried separately. These trials were the biggest news to ever hit Livingston County, Missouri. Prosecutors believe that Ray Copeland hired the workers at the homeless mission. He set up each one with a post office box and a checking account and took them to the local cattle auctions.
38 on one.
But before the checks could bounce, prosecutors say Ray Copeland would sell the cattle and kill the worker and bury the body.
They were lower than anybody else. He could care less about them. They were on government payroll. They didn't need to be there. They didn't even need to be alive. He had said that lots of times about transients.
Forensic tests proved that the men were all killed with Ray Copeland's gun. Ray Copeland was convicted of 5 counts of murder and sentenced to death.
Hooray. Ray deserved it for what he done to the transients and the people all through his life. I mean, he deserved a death sentence.
Faye Copeland denied any involvement in the murders, saying she was an abused wife who only did what she was told.
Back then, I just dropped my head and went ahead and took it. I've carried bruises, I've carried broken bones from him. But he was my husband legally.
I think she had some idea as far as the cattle scam going on. As far as the killings, I don't know. I don't think so. I hope, pray to God, she didn't know.
The list of workers in Faye Copeland's handwriting helped seal the case against her. Faye Copeland was also convicted of murder and was sentenced to death.
That is the only thing I think they convict her on, was the piece of paper with the names on.
Before Ray Copeland could be executed, he died in prison in 1993. In 1999, after 10 years on death row, Faye Copeland's sentence was commuted to life in prison.
I never go to bed, never close my eyes, but what I relive a lot of my life over, wondering, was I to blame? No. So why should I have to pay for something he done, if he done it?
Ray and Faye Copeland don't get much sympathy from the transients who live in the Missions on Commercial Street.
He said, I hope they keep her till she croaks. Don't have any feelings for people like that at all.
Of the 8 men on the Copeland's list, Thomas Park, Franklin Hudson, and Dale Brake are still missing. Police believe they too were murdered and that their bodies are buried nearby, somewhere.
The phone call came at 2:13 in the morning. A single sentence was spoken on the other end of the line, and within seconds, an entire town that had spent nearly 4 decades trying to forget was forced to remember everything. A cold case that had haunted Ohio since the summer of 1985 had finally moved again, not because of a new witness, not because of a confession, not because someone walked into a police station and admitted what they had done. It happened because of a piece of evidence that had been sitting quietly in storage for decades, untouched, waiting for science to catch up with the truth. For 39 years, the name of one victim had remained connected to a question nobody could answer. Who was responsible? And how could someone disappear into ordinary life after leaving behind a crime scene that shocked an entire community? In the small Ohio town where it happened, people still remember the summer nights of 1985. The streets were quieter then. Neighbors knew each other. Doors were often left unlocked. Children rode bicycles until the sun disappeared. People believed terrible things happened somewhere else. Not there, not in their town, not to someone they knew. But on one warm evening in July, that sense of safety collapsed, and the nightmare began. The victim was 27-year-old Sarah Whitmore, a woman described by everyone who knew her as determined, kind, and impossible to forget. She worked long hours, helped her family whenever they needed her, and had built a simple life filled with ordinary dreams. She was not someone who searched for danger. She was not someone who lived recklessly. She was simply someone who vanished. The last confirmed sighting of Sarah came on a Friday night. A co-worker remembered seeing her leave a local restaurant shortly after closing. She waved goodbye. She smiled. She told people she would see them soon. Those would become the final confirmed moments anyone had with her. By sunrise the next morning, Sarah was gone. At first, nobody panicked. Friends believed she might have decided to take a spontaneous trip. Her family thought Maybe she needed time alone. But as the hours passed, concern turned into fear. Sarah never missed work. She never ignored phone calls from her family. She never disappeared without telling someone. Something was wrong. The first search began with hope. Friends drove through nearby roads. Family members checked places she usually visited. Police officers searched areas around her home. But every hour without an answer made the situation darker. Then investigators found something that changed everything. Sarah's abandoned vehicle. It was discovered several miles outside town, parked near an isolated road surrounded by trees. The car appeared normal at first glance. No obvious damage. No broken windows. No signs of a crash. But inside, investigators noticed details that made them uneasy. Personal belongings were still there. Items Sarah would never intentionally leave behind. Her purse. Her identification. Things that suggested she had not simply walked away. The discovery transformed a missing person investigation into something far more serious. Police began treating the case as a possible abduction. And suddenly, the quiet Ohio community became the center of a frightening mystery. Detectives worked around the clock. They interviewed friends. They questioned coworkers. They examined every possible connection in Sarah's life. At the time, forensic technology was limited compared to what investigators have today. DNA testing was still developing. Digital records did not exist. There were no phone tracking systems. No cameras covering every street. Investigators had only traditional methods. Fingerprints, witness statements, physical evidence, and instinct. The first days produced dozens of theories. Some believed Sarah knew her attacker. Others believe a stranger had targeted her. Some focused on people who had crossed paths with her in the weeks before she disappeared. But every possible lead seemed to collapse under closer examination. One witness reported seeing a suspicious vehicle near the area where Sarah's car was found. Police followed the information. They searched for the driver. They questioned people. But nothing connected back to Sarah. Another person claimed they had seen Sarah arguing with someone shortly before her disappearance. Again, investigators followed the trail. Again, it led nowhere. The case slowly became a maze. Every path seemed to begin with possibility and end with silence. Weeks became months. Months became years. The headlines faded. The television cameras left. The reporters moved on to newer stories. But Sarah's family never stopped searching for answers. They kept her photographs. They kept her memory alive. They refused to accept that her story would become another forgotten file, sitting inside a police evidence room. But time has a cruel way of changing everything. People who once knew details began moving away. Memories became uncertain. Witnesses aged. Some passed away. The world changed. And the case became what investigators feared most. A cold case. A file marked inactive. A mystery frozen in time. For decades, Sarah Whitmore's name remained attached to a question that haunted everyone involved. How could someone commit such a crime and escape without leaving a trace? But hidden inside the evidence collected in 1985 was something nobody understood at the time. A tiny piece of information. A silent witness. Something so small that investigators had overlooked it. Something that would eventually become the key to unlocking the truth, because decades later, when technology reached the evidence that had been waiting all those years, investigators discovered something impossible to ignore. A DNA profile, a match, and a name connected to a crime that had remained buried for nearly 40 years. The shocking discovery would reopen old wounds. It would force a community to confront memories it had tried to bury, and it would lead investigators toward a suspect nobody expected. A person who had lived an ordinary life while carrying the secret of a night that changed everything. For 39 years, the killer believed the past was gone, forgotten, lost forever. But cold cases have a way of returning. And sometimes, the smallest piece of evidence can speak louder than decades of silence. For nearly 4 decades, the evidence sat untouched. A simple piece of material collected from a crime scene in 1985. At the time, investigators believed it might become important. They preserved it. They documented it. They stored it away. But they never imagined that one day, that same evidence would become the voice of a victim who had been silent for 39 years. In 1985, the tools available to detectives were limited. The science that exists today was only beginning to emerge. A fingerprint could identify a person. A witness could change the direction of an investigation. A confession could end a mystery. But there was one thing investigators did not have: the ability to look deep into microscopic traces and uncover a person's identity from something invisible to the human eye. DNA analysis would eventually transform criminal investigations. But for Sarah Whitmore's case, that breakthrough came decades too late. By the time technology advanced enough to examine old evidence, the original investigators had already spent years chasing dead ends. Some retired. Some moved to different departments. Some never saw the answer they had searched for. But one detective refused to let the case disappear completely. Detective Michael Reynolds had been one of the younger investigators assigned to Sarah's disappearance in 1985. He was only 31 years old at the time, fresh into his career, determined to prove himself. He remembered the case differently from others. To many people, it became another unsolved crime, another file number, another tragedy buried under years of silence. But to Reynolds, it was personal. He remembered Sarah's parents sitting in the police station, waiting for updates that never came. He remembered the frustration in the investigation room, the endless photographs, the stacks of interviews, the maps covering the walls, every possible theory, every possible suspect, and nothing, no answer, no justice, just silence. After retiring, Reynolds kept a copy of his old notes, not because he expected the case to reopen, but because he could never completely walk away from it. Every few years, he would look through the documents again. He would revisit the timeline. He would ask himself the same question: what did they miss? For years, he believed the answer was somewhere inside the original investigation, a detail overlooked, a witness ignored, a mistake made in those first critical hours. And eventually, he was right, but not in the way he expected. The breakthrough began with a new cold case review program. Across the country, police departments were reopening old investigations using modern technology. Cases once considered impossible were suddenly producing arrests. Old evidence was being tested again. DNA databases were expanding. Families who had waited decades were finally receiving answers. Sarah's case was placed on the list. At first, investigators had little expectation. The evidence was old. The crime scene had been processed nearly 40 years earlier. Many believed the chances of finding anything useful were extremely low. But the new team approached the case differently. They did not look at it as an old failure. They looked at it as an unfinished investigation. Every piece mattered. Every photograph. Every report. Every item stored from that night. The detectives began rebuilding the entire timeline. They studied Sarah's final day. They reviewed interviews from 1985. They searched for names that appeared more than once. They compared old statements with modern records. And then they found something unusual. A piece of evidence that had been mentioned in the original reports but never fully analyzed. At the time, investigators believed it was insignificant, a small trace left behind, something that seemed impossible to connect to anyone. But modern forensic specialists saw something different. They saw potential. The evidence was carefully removed from storage. New testing began. The process took months. There were no guarantees. Cold cases often reopen with excitement and end with disappointment. Families have been given hope before, only to have it taken away. But this time, something happened. Something investigators had not seen coming. The laboratory discovered a DNA profile, a complete profile, one that could potentially identify the person connected to Sarah's final moments. The result changed everything. Suddenly, a case that had been frozen since 1985 was moving again. Investigators entered a world that had changed completely since the crime occurred. The town had grown. People had moved. Technology had advanced. But one person remained connected to the evidence. The search for the DNA match began. At first, there was no direct hit. The profile did not immediately identify a suspect, but investigators were not discouraged. They used every available resource. They examined family connections. They searched genealogy databases. They followed biological links. And slowly, a picture began to form. A name started appearing. A person who had never been considered a serious suspect in 1985. Someone who had lived quietly for decades. Someone who had built a normal life, while the memory of Sarah's disappearance remained unresolved. The investigators did not rush. They knew one mistake could destroy the entire case. A DNA connection was not the end. It was the beginning. They needed to understand who this person was, where they had been in 1985, how they were connected to Sarah, and why their DNA appeared in evidence collected from the scene. The investigation moved carefully. Detectives watched. They reviewed records. They interviewed people who knew the suspect. And with every new discovery, the mystery became more disturbing, because the person connected to the evidence was not a stranger who vanished into the shadows. They were someone who had remained in plain sight, someone who had lived among the same communities, someone who had carried a secret for nearly 4 decades. The cold case was no longer just about finding a missing piece of the past. It was about confronting someone who had spent years believing the past would never return. But before investigators could make an arrest, they needed one final piece. A piece that would connect the DNA evidence to the events of that night in 1985. And as detectives dug deeper into the suspect's history, they discovered a series of details that would change the case forever. Details that had been hidden for decades. Details that would finally reveal why Sarah Whitmore disappeared on that summer night, and why the truth had remained buried for so long. The name connected to the DNA evidence changed the entire direction of the investigation. For years, investigators have been searching for a person who seemed to have vanished after committing an unimaginable crime. They imagined someone who ran, someone who abandoned their old life, someone who disappeared into another state, another identity, another world. But the truth was far more disturbing. The person they were looking for had never truly disappeared. They had simply blended in. They had gone to work. They had paid bills. They had spoken with neighbors. They had built relationships. They had lived a life that looked completely ordinary from the outside. And that was what shocked investigators the most. Because the greatest mysteries are not always hidden in dark places. Sometimes they are hidden behind familiar faces. When detectives confirmed the DNA profile belonged to a specific individual, they began reconstructing his connection to Sarah Whitmore. His name was Daniel Mercer, a man who was 24 years old in 1985, a man whose name appeared briefly in the original investigation, but had never been considered a primary suspect. At the time of Sarah's disappearance, Mercer had worked at a nearby auto repair shop. The location was only a few miles from where Sarah's abandoned vehicle was discovered. Investigators had spoken with him in 1985. He told them he had no information. He claimed he had never seen Sarah that night. His statement had been written down. His name had been added to the long list of people interviewed. And then the investigation moved on. For nearly 4 decades, nobody looked at him again, until DNA changed everything. Detectives returned to the original case files. They found Mercer's interview report buried among hundreds of pages. They read his statement again, then again, this time with a completely different perspective, because investigators were no longer looking for a random person. They were looking for someone whose DNA had been connected to evidence from the crime. Suddenly, small details that once seemed meaningless began to stand out. Mercer had known the area where Sarah's car was found. He worked close enough to have traveled those roads regularly. He had been familiar with the isolated locations surrounding the town, places where someone could disappear without being immediately discovered. At the time, none of those facts were enough to make him a suspect. But decades later, they created a disturbing pattern. The detectives began examining Mercer's life after 1985. They wanted to know where he went, what he did, whether there were other incidents connected to him. The answer created even more questions. After Sarah disappeared, Mercer left the area several months later. He moved to another city. He changed jobs. He started over. To anyone who knew him, the move appeared normal. People moved all the time. Young people searched for new opportunities. Families relocated. Careers changed. But investigators wondered if Mercer was simply leaving behind something he feared would eventually catch up with him. They began contacting people from his past. Former coworkers, old neighbors, friends. The conversations revealed something unusual. Several people described Mercer as quiet, private, difficult to read, not someone who attracted attention, not someone people remembered clearly. And that made the investigation even more complicated, because criminals often become known for their behavior, their anger, their violence, their mistakes. But Mercer seemed to spend decades avoiding exactly that. He created no obvious trail. He gave investigators nothing obvious to follow until the DNA evidence appeared. The breakthrough forced authorities to confront a painful possibility. What if the answer had been there from the beginning? What if the person they were searching for had been interviewed? What if the case had been solved in 1985 if the technology had existed? Those questions haunted everyone involved, especially Sarah's family. For 39 years, they lived with uncertainty. They never knew who took Sarah away. They never knew what happened during those final moments. They never knew if the person responsible was watching from somewhere nearby. Now, for the first time, they had a name. But having a name did not erase the pain. It created a new kind of emotional storm, because justice delayed does not feel the same as justice delivered. The family had spent decades imagining the moment when answers would come, but no one can truly prepare for the weight of finally knowing. When investigators contacted Sarah's relatives and told them about the DNA discovery, the reaction was a mixture of disbelief and heartbreak. They had waited almost 4 decades. A lifetime had passed. Children had grown up. People had gotten married. Loved ones had died without ever knowing the truth. Sarah's parents never got the answers they deserved. They never saw the person responsible held accountable. They carried that unanswered question until the end of their lives. But now, investigators were determined that Sarah's story would not end with silence. The next step was surveillance. Detectives needed more than a DNA connection. They needed confirmation. They needed to legally prove that the DNA profile connected to the evidence belonged to Daniel Mercer. So they watched him. They tracked his movements. They waited for an opportunity. And eventually, that opportunity came. Investigators collected discarded material connected to Mercer, a routine piece of evidence from everyday life, something he never expected anyone to examine. The sample was sent for testing. The result would determine whether the case that had survived nearly 4 decades would finally move toward an arrest. The waiting period was intense. For the detectives involved, this was not just another investigation. This was a case where every decision represented years of hope, years of pain, years of unanswered questions. A mistake could mean losing the chance forever. But when the laboratory results came back, there was no uncertainty. The DNA matched. The evidence from 1985. The evidence collected nearly 40 years earlier. The evidence that had remained silent for decades. It all pointed to one person, Daniel Mercer, the man who had once been questioned and released. The man who had walked away while Sarah's family searched for answers. The man who believed time had erased the truth. But time had not erased anything. It had only delayed the moment when the evidence would finally speak. On a quiet morning in Ohio, investigators prepared for the arrest. There were no cameras waiting, no dramatic announcement, no warning, just a team of detectives carrying the weight of a case that haunted them for decades. They approached Mercer's home, knowing that everything was about to change. For him, for Sarah's family, and for an entire community that had spent nearly 40 years wondering if they would ever see justice. The door opened, and the past finally caught up with him. The moment Daniel Mercer opened the door, he had no idea that the world he had built for nearly 40 years was about to collapse. To him, it was another ordinary morning, another quiet day, another moment where the past remained exactly where he believed he had left it, buried, forgotten, untouchable. But standing outside his home were investigators carrying something he could never escape, evidence, not rumors. Not theories, not accusations based on memories that had faded over decades. Evidence. A scientific link connecting him to a crime that had remained unresolved since 1985. The detectives introduced themselves calmly. They asked him to step outside. They told him why they were there. And for a brief moment, according to investigators, Mercer showed almost no reaction. No panic, no confusion, just silence. The same silence that had surrounded the case for decades. But investigators knew silence could hide many things. Fear, sulk, regret, or the realization that the one thing a person thought would never happen had finally arrived. The arrest of Daniel Mercer immediately sent shockwaves through Ohio. A case that many believed would remain unsolved forever was suddenly back in headlines. The phrase appeared everywhere. Cold case solved. Decades-old mystery ends with stunning arrest. DNA evidence reveals the truth behind forgotten murder. For people who remembered Sarah Whitmore, the news felt impossible. Some had spent years believing they would never hear an update. Some had forgotten the details of the case. Some had convinced themselves that whoever was responsible would never be found. Then, almost 40 years later, the impossible happened. The past returned, and it brought a name. But while the arrest answered one question, it opened many others. Why Sarah? Why that night? Why did the investigation fail in 1985? And how had Mercer managed to avoid suspicion for so long? Investigators began carefully rebuilding the events leading up to Sarah's disappearance. They went back to the beginning, the summer of 1985, a time when the town was still recovering from the shock of losing someone many people knew. Sarah had been living a normal life. She had plans. She had people who cared about her. She had no reason to believe that a simple evening would become the final chapter of her life. But somewhere between leaving work and the discovery of her abandoned vehicle, something happened. Something that changed everything. The original investigation showed that Sarah had likely encountered someone she did not consider a threat. Someone who could approach her without immediately creating fear. Someone who had access to the places where she was last seen. That detail had always troubled investigators. Because Sarah was careful. She was not someone who would willingly put herself in danger. The person responsible had to gain her trust, or catch her completely off guard. For years, detectives had searched for that missing moment. The few minutes that separated Sarah's normal evening from the beginning of a tragedy. And now, with Mercer identified, they believed they finally understood how the pieces connected. But the case was not over. An arrest was only the beginning. A courtroom would require proof. A jury would require a story supported by facts. And prosecutors knew that solving a cold case was different from proving one. The passage of time created challenges. Memories changed. Evidence disappeared. Witnesses became harder to locate. Some people connected to the original investigation were no longer alive, but prosecutors had something powerful, something that did not depend on human memory. The DNA, the evidence collected in 1985, had survived. It had waited. And when science finally examined it properly, it pointed toward the truth. The news of Mercer's arrest reached Sarah's former co-workers. Many struggled to process it. Some remembered him. Others barely recalled his name. That was one of the most disturbing aspects of the case. The suspect was not a mysterious figure from the shadows. He was someone who had existed in the same world as Sarah. Someone whose name had been written in the original files. Someone who had been part of the story from the beginning. The community began revisiting old memories. People looked through photographs, old newspaper articles, family albums. They remembered the fear that spread to the town in 1985. Parents who once warned their children not to walk alone. Neighbors who began watching unfamiliar cars. Residents who wondered if danger had been closer than anyone realized. The arrest reopened those emotions. The fear, the anger, the sadness. But it also brought something the community had not felt in decades. Hope. For Sarah's family, the announcement was both devastating and relieving. They finally had an answer. But answers do not erase years of suffering. They cannot return lost birthdays. They cannot restore missed conversations. They cannot bring back the years stolen by uncertainty. A cold case ending does not mean the pain disappears. It means the unanswered questions finally have somewhere to go. As investigators prepared the case for court, they continued examining Mercer's background. They searched for any indication that Sarah's disappearance was not an isolated event. They looked at previous locations where he lived. They reviewed old reports. They searched for connections that may have been missed. Every cold case investigation carries the same terrifying possibility. That one victim may not have been the only victim. Investigators wanted to know if Sarah had been the beginning or the end. Their search uncovered details about Mercer's life after 1985. He had created distance from his past. He avoided attention. He maintained a low profile. Neighbors described him as polite but distant, the kind of person people recognize without truly knowing. That description disturbed investigators because it fit the pattern they had seen many times before. Someone capable of hiding in plain sight. Someone who understood how to appear ordinary. Someone who counted on time becoming his protection. But time had become his enemy. Every year that passed brought new technology. Every decade created new possibilities. Every piece of preserved evidence became more valuable. Mercer had believed 1985 belonged to another world. A world without advanced DNA testing. A world where unanswered questions could remain unanswered forever. But science does not forget. Evidence does not forget. And victims do not disappear simply because years pass. The courtroom would eventually force Mercer to face the story he had avoided for decades. A story written through evidence, through memories, through the final traces left behind by Sarah Whitmore. And as the community waited for trial to begin, one question remained louder than all the others. After nearly 40 years of silence, would Daniel Mercer finally reveal what happened that night in 1985? The courtroom doors opened almost 40 years after Sarah Whitmore disappeared. A case that began with confusion, fear, and unanswered questions had finally reached a place where every detail will be examined. Every piece of evidence, every statement, every decision made on that summer night in 1985. For decades, Sarah's name had existed in a painful space between memory and mystery. She was remembered by her family, remembered by friends, remembered by investigators who refused to forget. But now, for the first time, her story was moving toward a conclusion. And sitting across the courtroom was the man prosecutors believed was responsible, Daniel Mercer, the same person whose name had appeared briefly in the original investigation, the same person whose DNA had finally connected him to evidence collected nearly 4 decades earlier. The atmosphere surrounding the trial was unlike anything the town had experienced before. Reporters arrived from across the state. Old photographs from 1985 appeared again on television screens. The words "cold case solved" repeated across headlines. But behind the headlines was a deeper story. A story about time. A story about loss. A story about how one family spent nearly 40 years waiting for a truth they feared might never come. Inside the courtroom, prosecutors began building the timeline. They started where every investigation starts, with the victim, not the suspect, not the evidence. Sarah. They described who she was before she became a name in a case file. They talked about her personality, her routines, the people who loved her, the ordinary life that was interrupted by an extraordinary tragedy, because prosecutors wanted the jury to understand something important. Sarah Whitmore was not a case number. She was not a photograph attached to an investigation. She was a person, a daughter, a friend, someone whose future was taken away. Then came the night of her disappearance. The prosecution presented the timeline carefully. They explained Sarah's final confirmed movements. They showed where she had been seen, where her vehicle was found, how investigators in 1985 began searching for answers. The courtroom became silent as old photographs appeared, images from the original crime scene, images from a time when investigators had no idea they were standing at the beginning of a mystery that would last decades. Then came the evidence that changed everything. The DNA, the moment everyone had been waiting for. Forensic experts explained how advances in technology allowed them to examine evidence that had remained untouched for years. They explained how DNA could identify a person with extraordinary accuracy. They describe how the profile collected from the evidence matched Daniel Mercer. The defense challenged the evidence. They questioned the handling of old material. They questioned whether the passage of time created uncertainty. They argued that decades could change circumstances, that memories could become unreliable, that an old investigation could contain mistakes. But prosecutors had expected those arguments. They knew the defense would focus on time, because time was the biggest challenge in the case. 40 years had passed. 40 years since Sarah disappeared. 40 years since investigators first walked through the evidence. 40 years since the community first demanded answers. But prosecutors argued that time did not weaken the evidence. It strengthened it, because the DNA did not come from a memory. It did not come from a rumor. It did not come from a person trying to remember details from nearly half a century earlier. It came from science, and science had pointed directly toward Mercer. The trial also examined Mercer's original interview from 1985. The jury heard how he had been questioned during the first investigation, how he had told detectives he had no information, how his name had been recorded but eventually forgotten. That moment became one of the most disturbing parts of the case, because it raised a haunting possibility. The person investigators were searching for may have been closer than anyone realized. For Sarah's family, hearing those details was painful. They had spent decades wondering if the truth would ever come. Now they were sitting inside a courtroom, listening to the story unfold piece by piece. Some moments brought relief. Others brought anger, because every answer created another reminder of what had been lost. During the trial, prosecutors introduced additional evidence about Mercer's movements after Sarah disappeared. They explained how he left the area, how he started a new chapter of his life, how he continued living while Sarah's family remained trapped in uncertainty. To many people watching, that became the most difficult part to understand. How could someone move forward? How could someone wake up every morning? How could someone build a normal life while carrying the weight of a hidden truth? The prosecution argued that Mercer relied on one thing above all else: time. He believed time would protect him. He believed witnesses would forget. He believed evidence would disappear. He believed the world of 1985 would remain locked in the past. But he underestimated one thing: the future. The same technology that did not exist when Sarah died eventually became the reason investigators found him. The evidence he believed was meaningless became the evidence that exposed him. During the trial, investigators described the moment they received the DNA confirmation. They described the reaction inside the department. Years of work, years of uncertainty, suddenly replaced by one undeniable result: a match, a name, a path forward. For the detectives involved, it was a moment they had imagined for years. But even they understood something important. Solving the case was not the same as healing the wounds. No arrest could give Sarah's family back the years they lost. No verdict could erase decades of waiting. No courtroom decision could undo the pain. But justice meant something. It meant Sarah's story would no longer end with a question mark. It meant her name would no longer be connected only to mystery. It meant the person accused of taking her life would finally have to answer for what happened. As the trial continued, the town watched closely. People who had grown up hearing about Sarah's disappearance followed every update. Younger generations learned the story for the first time. They discovered that behind every cold case headline was a real person, a real family, a real loss, and a truth that had waited years to be uncovered. But as the final days of the trial approached, one question remained. Would the jury believe the evidence was enough? Would 4 decades of silence finally be broken by a verdict? Or would the case that had survived for so long face one final unexpected twist? Because after 39 years, Sarah Whitmore's story had reached its most critical moment, and everyone inside that courtroom knew the next decision would determine how history remembered one of Ohio's most haunting cold cases. The final days of the trial carried a weight that everyone inside the courtroom could feel. This was no longer just an investigation, no longer a search for clues, no longer a desperate attempt to understand what happened in the summer of 1985. This was the moment when decades of waiting would finally meet a decision. For Sarah Whitmore's family, The courtroom had become the place where the past and present collided. Every photograph, every piece of evidence, every word spoken by witnesses brought them back to the same painful question they had carried for nearly 40 years. Why did this happen? And why did it take so long to uncover the truth? The prosecution returned to the evidence that had changed everything. The DNA, the invisible connection between the past and the present, the trace that survived when memories disappeared, when people moved away, when years turned into decades. The prosecutors reminded the jury that the evidence had been collected in 1985, long before anyone knew how powerful DNA analysis would become. At the time, investigators were searching through darkness. They were trying to solve a crime without the tools that modern detectives consider essential. But the evidence was there, waiting, silent, preserved. The prosecution argued that the DNA was not a coincidence. It was not a mistake. It was not a random discovery. It was the final voice of a victim whose story had been unfinished for decades. The defense continued to challenge the case. They questioned the investigation. They questioned the passage of time. They questioned whether a person could truly be connected to an event that happened so many years earlier. They told the jury that decades could create uncertainty, that evidence collected long ago required careful examination, that the burden of proof remained the highest standard in the justice system. But prosecutors remained focused. They did not rely on emotion alone. They relied on facts, the evidence, the timeline, the connection between Mercer and the crime scene, the same connection that investigators had searched for since 1985. Then came the testimony that many in the courtroom had been waiting for. The investigators who worked the original case returned to tell their story. Some were older now. Some had retired years earlier. Some walked slowly into the courtroom carrying memories they had kept for almost half a century. They described the first days after Sarah disappeared, the panic, the search, the endless hours trying to find answers. They described the frustration of watching the case go cold. They described the feeling of knowing a family was waiting for something they could not provide. One retired detective told the court that unsolved cases never truly leave investigators. They stay with them. They follow them. They become part of their lives. Because every cold case represents someone who never received justice, someone whose story stopped before it should have. The courtroom listened as a detective described the original investigation, the interviews, the evidence collection, the people questioned, the possibilities considered. And then, after all those years, the breakthrough, the moment modern technology reopened a door everyone thought had been permanently closed. The testimony revealed something powerful. The investigators in 1985 had not failed because they did not care. They had been fighting a battle with limited weapons. They were searching in a world before advanced forensic science could reveal what was hidden. The case had not been forgotten. It had been waiting. When the jury finally received the case, the atmosphere inside the courthouse changed. The arguments were finished. The evidence had been presented. The questions had been asked. Now came the hardest part, a decision. Outside the courthouse, people gathered. Some held photographs of Sarah. Some carried messages supporting her family. Because after so many years, everyone understood they were witnessing the end of something that had haunted the community for generations. Inside the jury room, the members reviewed everything. They examined the timeline. They reviewed the forensic testimony. They discussed the DNA evidence. They considered every argument from both sides. The decision could not be rushed. A case this old carried enormous responsibility. A mistake would affect everyone. Sarah's family, the accused, the community, the memory of the victim. Hours passed, then more hours. People waited. Reporters watched the courthouse doors. Families checked for updates. The entire town seemed frozen. And then, finally, the message came. The jury had reached a decision. The courtroom filled quickly. Everyone stood as the jury entered. Daniel Mercer sat silently. His expression was difficult to read. For years, he had avoided the attention surrounding Sarah's disappearance. But now there was nowhere left to hide. The judge asked the jury for the verdict. The courtroom became completely silent. A silence so heavy that every person inside could feel the history behind that moment. Then the words were spoken. Guilty. A single word. But it carried the weight of nearly 40 years. For Sarah's family, it was the moment they had waited for. Not a celebration. Not happiness. Nothing could bring Sarah back. Nothing could restore the years they lost. But it was an acknowledgement. The world finally recognized what happened. Sarah's name was no longer attached only to mystery. She was no longer just a woman who disappeared in 1985. She was a woman whose case proved that truth can survive time. The arrest and conviction became one of the most significant cold case resolutions in Ohio history. News organizations across the country reported the story. The headline that once seemed impossible became reality. Ohio 1985 cold case solved. Decades-old mystery ends with stunning arrest. DNA evidence reveals the truth after 39 years. But beyond the headlines was a deeper message. A message about patience, about persistence, about the power of evidence. Because the case had not been solved by a sudden confession. It had not been solved by luck. It had been solved because people refused to stop searching. Investigators who kept the files. Scientists who examined old evidence. Family members who refused to let Sarah disappear from memory. Everyone played a part in bringing the truth back into the light. But even after the verdict, one question remained in the minds of many. How had Daniel Mercer managed to live with this secret for so long? How had he looked at the world every day knowing that the truth was hidden beneath the surface? And what happened during those final moments of Sarah's life? Those questions continued to follow the case. Because solving a cold case does not erase every mystery. Sometimes, it only reveals the darkest parts that were hidden underneath. And as investigators continue reviewing the evidence, they discover that the story of Sarah Whitmore's disappearance contained more details than anyone had ever known. Details about that final night. Details about the investigation. Details about the person who had spent decades believing he had escaped forever. The cold case had finally been solved. But the truth behind it was more disturbing than anyone expected. The verdict was delivered. The courtroom emptied. The cameras disappeared. The reporters moved on to the next breaking story. But for the people who had lived with the mystery of Sarah Whitmore's disappearance for nearly 40 years, the case did not simply end when the judge announced a decision. Because some questions do not disappear with conviction. Some memories do not fade because a courtroom reaches a conclusion. Some wounds remain open even after justice arrives. The story of Sarah's disappearance was no longer about searching for a suspect. It was about understanding how a crime could remain hidden for so long. How one person could carry a secret through decades of ordinary life. And how a small piece of evidence, forgotten for years, could eventually destroy the illusion of escape. After the trial, investigators returned once again to the timeline of 1985. They wanted to understand every moment, every decision, every movement, not because they doubted the outcome, but because cold cases often leave behind a haunting question. What was missed? What detail was overlooked? What could have changed everything if the technology of tomorrow had existed yesterday? The answer was complicated, because the investigation in 1985 was not a story of people who did not care. It was a story of a different era. A time before modern forensic databases, before advanced DNA analysis, before investigators could search microscopic traces for answers hidden inside human cells. Detectives in 1985 had worked with what they had. They followed leads. They interviewed witnesses. They collected evidence. They searched for Sarah. But the one thing that could have changed everything was invisible. The evidence that would eventually identify Daniel Mercer could not speak at the time. It had to wait. And while the evidence waited, life continued. For Sarah's family, life continued without her. That was the part people outside the case often struggled to understand. A cold case is not just a police file. It is a family living with an empty chair. A birthday that arrives without celebration. A holiday where someone important is missing. A photograph that becomes more painful with every passing year. Sarah's loved ones carried those moments silently. They watched the world move forward while they remained connected to a single night in 1985. The night when everything changed. After conviction, family members spoke publicly about Sarah. They wanted people to remember who she was before the tragedy. Not just a victim, not just a name in a headline. They remembered her laugh, her kindness, the way she helped people, the small details that made her human. Because after decades of being associated with mystery, they wanted Sarah's life to become the focus again, not only the way she died, but the way she lived. Meanwhile, investigators continued examining Daniel Mercer's history. The arrest had answered the central question, but authorities wanted to know if there were other connections, other incidents, other unanswered cases. They searched through records from the places where Mercer had lived after leaving Ohio. They reviewed old reports. They contacted law enforcement agencies. They looked for patterns, because investigators knew something important. A person who commits a serious crime may not always leave behind obvious signs. Sometimes the only clue is hidden in the past, a forgotten report, a strange coincidence, a detail that only becomes meaningful after the truth is discovered. The search did not immediately reveal another confirmed connection, but the investigation itself raised disturbing questions about how well someone could hide. Mercer had not lived like a fugitive. He had not spent decades running. He had not changed his identity. He had simply moved forward. That fact disturbed many people in the community because it challenged the way they imagined criminals. Many expected someone responsible for such a crime to look dangerous, to behave differently, to stand out. But Mercer had done the opposite. He blended in. He became ordinary. And that was perhaps the most unsettling part of the entire case. The idea that someone connected to one of Ohio's most haunting mysteries could exist quietly among everyone else. The neighbors who knew him after 1985 described someone who seemed normal, someone who kept to himself, someone who rarely created problems. They struggled to understand how the person they knew could be connected to something so devastating. But investigators explained that appearances could be misleading. A person's public life does not always reveal their hidden actions, and decades of normal behavior cannot erase evidence from the past. The DNA had connected two moments separated by nearly 40 years. The night Sarah disappeared, and the day investigators finally found the answer. One moment frozen in tragedy, one moment filled with justice. The case became a powerful example of how cold cases can change over time. A mystery that once seemed impossible could suddenly become solvable, not because the past changed, but because the tools used to examine it became stronger. Across the country, families of other missing people watched the case closely. They saw something they had almost stopped believing: hope, because Sarah's story showed that time does not always protect those responsible. Sometimes time works in another direction. Every year brings new technology. Every year creates new opportunities. Every year gives investigators another chance to examine what was once impossible. The phrase cold case often suggests something forgotten, something abandoned, something frozen forever. But Sarah's case proved something different. A cold case is not always a closed door. Sometimes it is a door waiting for the right key. And in this case, that key was DNA. A discovery too advanced for 1985. A discovery that arrived decades later. A discovery that transformed a mystery into an answer. But for many people in Ohio, the most haunting part of the story was still the question of time. How many years had passed before justice arrived? How many conversations happened while the truth remained hidden? How many times did Sarah's name appear in someone's memory while the person responsible lived normally? Those thoughts remained with the community long after the trial ended, because the case was solved. But the impact remained. The empty spaces remained. The memories remained. And the lesson remained clear. A secret can survive for years. A person can hide from the world. But evidence has a way of waiting. And sometimes, after decades of silence, the smallest trace can return and tell the story everyone thought would never be known. The days after conviction brought a strange feeling to the town. For nearly 4 decades, the community had lived with uncertainty, a question that followed them through every season, every year, every generation. Where was Sarah Whitmore? What happened to her? Who was responsible? Now they finally had an answer. But answers do not always bring the peace people imagine. Sometimes answers bring a different kind of silence. A silence filled with reflection. A silence where people look back and realize how much time has been lost. The case that once represented uncertainty now represented something else. A reminder that justice can arrive slowly, sometimes painfully slowly, but it can still arrive. For the investigators who worked the case, the conviction marked the end of a journey that began long before modern technology existed. Many of them look back at the original investigation files, the faded photographs, the handwritten notes, the witness statements recorded on paper. They saw the world they had worked in back in 1985, a world without the tools they had today, a world where detectives had to depend almost entirely on observation interviews and physical evidence they could see. They understood why the case remained unsolved, but they also understood something else. Every investigation leaves behind a story. Every piece of evidence has a history. And sometimes the smallest detail becomes the most important one. The evidence connected to Sarah had survived through decades of change. It survived changes in police departments, changes in technology, changes in the people who handled the case. It survived because someone believed it was worth preserving. That decision, made nearly 40 years earlier, became the foundation for justice. The forensic experts involved in the case described the process as a race against time, not because the evidence was disappearing, but because every year created new challenges. The people who originally knew Sarah were getting older. The investigators who first searched for her were retiring. Memories that once felt clear became harder to recall. But DNA did not age the same way. It did not forget. It did not change its story. It remained exactly where it had been since the night of the crime, waiting for science to uncover what had been hidden. That was what made Sarah's case so powerful. It was not solved because someone suddenly remembered a forgotten detail. It was not solved because a person confessed after years of guilt. It was solved because evidence that had been silent finally found a voice. The community continued to talk about the case long after the cameras left. People gathered in places where Sarah had once spent time. They shared stories. They remembered moments from decades earlier. Many admitted that they had never expected to see the day when the mystery would be solved. Some had believed the person responsible would never be found. Some had accepted that the truth might disappear forever. But the arrest changed the way people thought about unsolved crimes. It showed them that time does not always erase evidence. Sometimes time preserves it. The case also brought attention to other families still waiting for answers. Families who watched the news and wondered if their own cold cases could one day have the same ending. They saw Sarah's story and realized that an investigation does not always end when the headlines disappear. Sometimes it continues quietly, behind closed doors, inside evidence rooms, in laboratories, with detectives who refuse to stop looking. Because every unsolved case represents someone who is still waiting, someone whose family still hopes, someone whose story is unfinished. And that was the legacy of Sarah Whitmore's case. Not only that justice was finally achieved, but that forgotten victims can still be remembered. Years after the trial, investigators continued receiving messages from people connected to the case. Former residents, old witnesses, people who had followed the story from the beginning. Many shared the same feeling. They were relieved, but they were also haunted by the realization that the truth had been nearby all along. The original investigation had included Mercer's name. His interview existed in the files. His connection to the area was known, yet the case remained unsolved. Not because the answer did not exist, but because the world did not yet have the ability to see it. That idea stayed with many people. The thought that countless mysteries may still have answers hidden somewhere. Inside old evidence boxes. Inside forgotten reports. Inside details that investigators once believed were meaningless. Modern forensic science has changed the way people view the past. A crime scene is no longer only what investigators can see. It is a collection of information, a collection of possibilities, a story waiting to be interpreted. And sometimes that story takes decades to tell. The investigation into Sarah's disappearance became a symbol of that transformation. A case that began with fear in 1985. A case that went cold a case that survived through years of uncertainty, and a case that finally returned to life because one piece of evidence refused to disappear. But for Sarah's family, the most important moment came not in the courtroom, not during the arrest, not when the headlines appeared. It came when they were finally able to say her name without adding the same painful question afterward. Before, every mention of Sarah carried uncertainty. Now it carried remembrance. Her story was no longer only about what happened to her. It was about who she was, the person she had been before tragedy, the life she should have continued living, the memories people still carried. That was the difference between a mystery and a memory. A mystery keeps people searching. A memory allows people to honor someone. And after decades of waiting, Sarah Whitmore was finally remembered not as an unsolved case, but as a person whose story had finally been heard. Yet even with justice served, one final question continued to echo. How many other cases were still waiting for their moment? How many victims were still hidden behind unanswered questions? How many families were still sitting beside empty chairs, hoping that one day someone would knock on their door with the news they had waited years to hear? Because the truth behind cold cases is always the same. Time can bury evidence. Time can change people. Time can make memories fade. But time cannot erase what happened. And sometimes, after decades of silence, the past find a way to return. The return of Sarah Whitmore's case to the headlines changed something deeper than a single investigation. It changed the way people looked at the word cold case. For years, many believed a cold case was simply a case that had failed, a file placed on a shelf, a mystery that investigators could not solve, a story that had already ended. But Sarah's case proved something different. A cold case is not always dead. Sometimes it is only waiting. Waiting for a new detective. Waiting for a new idea. Waiting for technology to catch up with evidence that has been silent for decades. And in Sarah's case, that silence lasted nearly 40 years. 40 years of unanswered questions. 40 years of speculation. 40 years where the person responsible believed the past would remain buried. But the past was never gone. It was preserved, locked inside evidence collected from a crime scene in 1985, hidden inside details that investigators at the time could not fully understand. The world changed. Science changed. And eventually, the truth changed from a possibility into a fact. After conviction, investigators began receiving requests from other departments asking how the case was solved. They wanted to understand the process. They wanted to know how evidence that had remained untouched for so long could suddenly become the key to an arrest. The answer was not one single breakthrough. It was a combination of persistence, technology, and the decision to never completely abandon the search. The original detectives had preserved the evidence. The new investigators had reopened the file. The scientists had examined the smallest traces left behind. Each person played a role. Each moment mattered. Because in cold cases, there is rarely one dramatic discovery. Usually, the truth is built piece by piece. A small detail, a forgotten report, a sample collected decades earlier, a name that appears again, a connection that finally makes sense. That was what happened with Sarah. The investigation did not suddenly become easy. It became possible. The difference was everything. For the detectives who reopened the case, the most difficult part was returning to a crime scene that belonged to another generation. The streets had changed. Buildings had changed. People had changed. The town Sarah knew in 1985 was not the same town decades later. But the investigators knew something remained. The evidence, the story, the truth. They walked through locations connected to the case. They studied old maps. They compared photographs from 1985 with the present day. They tried to understand the environment Sarah experienced during her final hours. Every location held memories. Every road carried a piece of the mystery. For residents who had lived there since the beginning, the reopening of the case brought back emotions they thought they had buried. Some remembered the fear that spread through the town. Some remembered the searches, the posters, the conversations, the constant hope that Sarah would somehow return. They remembered checking the news every day, waiting for an update, waiting for a miracle. But days turned into weeks. Weeks turned into months. And eventually, the world moved on, except Sarah's family. They never moved on completely. They learned to live with the pain. But they never stopped wondering. They never stopped hoping. That is a part of missing person cases that many people never see. The investigation may become inactive. The headlines may disappear. But for families, the case remains open every single day, every morning, every night, every moment when they wonder what could have been. The conviction brought a form of closure. But closure did not mean forgetting. Sarah's family made that clear. They did not want people to remember only the crime. They wanted people to remember her life, the woman she was, the dreams she had, the people she loved. Because every victim in a cold case has a story before the tragedy, a favorite song, a favorite place, a daily routine, a personality, a future that was never completed. Sarah had all those things, and for decades, her family protected those memories. The investigation also revealed something disturbing about time. Time can create distance between a crime and the people searching for answers. But time can also create confidence in those who believe they escaped. A person can begin to believe they succeeded. They can convince themselves that the world has forgotten, that everyone has moved on, that the evidence is meaningless, that no one is looking anymore. But technology does not forget. A database does not forget. Evidence does not forget. And that became one of the strongest messages from Sarah's case. The person responsible did not escape justice. They only delayed it. The arrest of Daniel Mercer also changed the lives of the investigators who worked on the case. For some, it represented the conclusion of a promise made decades earlier, a promise to a family that they would never stop searching. For others, it represented a reminder that every cold case deserves another look, because behind every old file is a person whose family is still waiting, a person whose story may still have an ending. Across Ohio, the case became a conversation about forgotten investigations. People began asking questions about other unsolved crimes, other missing persons, other families still waiting for answers. The phrase cold case no longer sounded like the end. It sounded like a challenge to keep looking, a challenge to believe that time is not always the enemy. Sometimes, time is what allows the truth to finally emerge. Years after Sarah's disappearance, investigators gathered once more to review the evidence, not because they questioned the verdict, but because every case leaves behind lessons. They studied what worked, what failed, what could help future investigations. And the conclusion was clear. The smallest pieces of evidence can become the strongest voices. A single trace, a single connection, a single discovery. That was enough to change everything. The case that began with a missing woman in a quiet Ohio town ended with a lesson heard far beyond the state. A lesson about patience, about determination, about the power of science, and about the victims who wait silently while the world searches for answers. Because the most haunting part of a cold case is not always the mystery itself. It is knowing that somewhere, someone knows the truth. And for nearly 40 years, Sarah's truth remained hidden. Until one day, the evidence finally spoke. The evidence had spoken. After nearly 40 years of silence, the question that had followed Sarah Whitmore's family for decades finally had an answer. But the aftermath of a solved cold case is often more complicated than people expect. The world sees the arrest, the headlines, the courtroom, the final verdict. But behind those moments are years of emotions that do not disappear overnight. For Sarah's family, the ending of the investigation was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of learning how to live with the truth. For almost 4 decades, uncertainty had been a part of their daily lives. Uncertainty was painful, but certainty could be painful too. Because once the mystery was solved, they had to face a reality they had spent years trying not to imagine. The person responsible had been living a normal life while they were searching, while they were waiting, while they were keeping Sarah's memory alive. He had been moving forward. That realization created a complicated mixture of emotions: anger, sadness, relief, and a feeling that many families of cold case victims describe as impossible to explain. The feeling of finally knowing. The first years after Sarah disappeared had been filled with action. Search teams, interviews, investigations, phone calls. Every day brought the possibility of a breakthrough. Every day carried hope. But when the investigation went cold, the silence became the hardest part. There were no more updates, no more new information, no more reasons to believe an answer was coming soon. The case became a shadow, always present, never resolved. That was a reality many families of missing people experience. The world sees an old case file. The family sees a missing piece of their own life. Sarah's disappearance affected everyone who knew her. Friends who once expected to see her again. Co-workers who remembered her final conversations. Neighbors who remembered the fear that spread through the community. Even people who never met her felt connected to the case. Because some crimes change the atmosphere of an entire town. They change how people think. They change how people trust. They change how safe ordinary moments feel. After Sarah vanished, simple routines became frightening. Walking home after dark. Stopping at an unfamiliar location. Speaking with strangers. Things people once did without thinking suddenly carried a sense of danger. The town learned a painful lesson. That terrible things can happen in ordinary places. And ordinary people can become part of extraordinary tragedies. Years later, when the arrest was announced, many residents described the same feeling. They remembered where they were when they heard. Some were watching television. Some heard the news from friends. Some saw the headline online. But almost everyone had the same reaction. Disbelief. Because after so many years, people had stopped expecting an answer. The case had become part of local history. A mystery people talked about in quiet conversations. A story passed from one generation to another. Parents told their children. Neighbors remembered the old days. The name Sarah Whitmore remained. And then suddenly, after decades, the mystery had a conclusion. The arrest also forced people to reconsider their memories of the past. Many residents looked back and wondered what they had missed, what signs they failed to see. What moments had passed without anyone realizing their importance? That is one of the most difficult parts of solved cold cases. After the truth is revealed, people often search the past looking for clues. They replay conversations. They revisit memories. They ask questions that may never have answers. Could someone have noticed something? Could someone have stopped it? Could Sarah have been saved? Those questions can remain long after the investigation ends. But investigators repeatedly emphasize one important fact. The responsibility belonged to the person who committed the crime, not the community, not the family, not the people who searched. The truth was that one person made a choice that changed countless lives. And for decades, that person believed they could avoid consequences. The conviction of Daniel Mercer became a reminder that justice does not always follow the timeline people expect. Sometimes it arrives quickly. Sometimes it takes years. Sometimes it takes nearly an entire lifetime. But the passage of time does not erase accountability. The case also highlighted the evolution of forensic science. In 1985, investigators could only work with the technology available to them. They relied on interviews, physical evidence, human observation. But decades later, forensic methods had transformed. A tiny biological sample could reveal what thousands of interviews could not. A microscopic trace could identify a person. A forgotten piece of evidence could become the center of an entire investigation. That transformation changed criminal justice forever. Because every old case file suddenly carried a new possibility. Every preserved piece of evidence represented a potential answer. Every unsolved mystery had a chance to return. For younger investigators who studied Sarah's case, it became an example of patience and persistence. They saw how important it was to preserve evidence, how important it was to revisit old investigations, how important it was to remember that unsolved does not mean impossible. The phrase itself began to change. Cold case. 2 words that once sounded like an ending. Now, they represented something different. A challenge, a promise, a reminder that some truths simply take longer to uncover. But even after justice was served, one haunting image remained connected to Sarah's story. The evidence box. The same box that had sat quietly for decades. The same evidence that investigators once stored away without knowing its future importance. Inside that box was the answer everyone had been searching for, not because someone found something new, but because someone finally knew how to understand what was already there. That was a strange and powerful reality of Sarah's case. The truth had been present from the beginning, hidden, silent, waiting. And when the right moment arrived, it changed everything. The community would never forget the years of uncertainty. They would never forget the fear of 1985. They would never forget the family who waited. But they would also never forget the moment when a decades-old mystery finally ended. The moment when a cold case became a solved case. The moment when a forgotten piece of evidence brought justice back into the light. And the moment when everyone learned the same lesson. Some secrets can survive for decades. Some people can hide from the world. But the truth has a way of finding its way home. The story of Sarah Whitmore's disappearance had finally reached the ending everyone had waited for. But for the people who spent decades connected to the case, the final chapter did not feel like an ending. It felt like the closing of a door that had remained open for far too long. A door filled with questions. A door filled with memories. A door that had allowed the pain of one summer night in 1985 to continue following an entire community for generations. When investigators first arrived at Sarah's abandoned vehicle nearly 40 years earlier, they could not have imagined what was ahead. They did not know the case would become one of Ohio's most haunting mysteries. They did not know the evidence collected that day would survive longer than many of the people involved. They did not know that a technology that did not yet exist would eventually reveal what happened. At that moment, they only knew one thing. Someone was missing, and someone needed to find her. The first search for Sarah was filled with urgency. Officers walked through fields. Volunteers searched roads. Families distributed photographs. Neighbors gathered information. Everyone believed an answer would come quickly. That belief is common in the early days of a disappearance. People expect the missing person to return. They expect a phone call, a sighting, a simple explanation. But when those moments never come, hope begins to change. It becomes heavier. It becomes something people carry instead of something they feel. Sarah's family carried that weight for decades. They learned how to function while missing someone. They learned how to continue living while part of their lives remained frozen in 1985. That is invisible damage left behind by unsolved crimes. The world continues moving, but for the people closest to the victim, time feels different. A birthday can bring back memories. A familiar song can reopen old emotions. A place can suddenly transport someone back decades. The past never fully disappears. It waits. The conviction of Daniel Mercer changed the public story. For years, the question had been, who did this? After the arrest, the question became, how did this happen? How did a person connected to such a devastating crime remain unknown for so long? Investigators explained that Mercer benefited from something many suspects in old cases benefit from, the passing of time. Every year that went by reduced public attention. Every year created more distance between the crime and the investigation. People who once remembered details moved away. Some forgot. Some died. Records became harder to locate. The world that existed in 1985 slowly disappeared. And that disappearance created a false sense of safety, a belief that the past could never return. But the past did return. It returned through evidence, through science, through investigators willing to reopen a file that many thought had already reached its final page. After the case was solved, forensic experts explained how important preservation had been. The evidence was not valuable because it looked dramatic. It was valuable because it contained information. Information that could not be seen. Information that required the right tools. This became one of the most important lessons from Sarah's case. Evidence does not always reveal its importance immediately. Sometimes it requires time. Sometimes it requires patience. Sometimes it requires an entirely new generation of investigators. The detectives who solved the case were not the same detectives who began it. They inherited a mystery, a collection of reports, a box of evidence, a story interrupted by decades of silence. and they continued where others had stopped. Not because the case was easy, because it mattered. That mindset became the foundation of the investigation. They did not see Sarah as an old case. They saw her as a person who deserved answers. They saw a family who deserved peace. They saw a community that deserved the truth. During interviews after the conviction, investigators often returned to the same message. The case was solved because people refused to give up. Not one person, not one moment, not one discovery. A chain of decisions made over many years. A detective who kept notes. An officer who preserved evidence. A scientist who examined old material. A family that kept asking questions. Each part connected. Each part moved the case closer to the truth. The story also became a warning for anyone who believed they could escape accountability. The world of 1985 was gone. The technology had changed. The investigators had changed. But the evidence remained. That was the mistake many criminals make. They believe time destroys everything. They believe memories fade. They believe evidence becomes useless. But sometimes time creates opportunities, because every year brings new methods, new discoveries, new ways to look at old problems. And sometimes the thing that was ignored for decades becomes a thing that solves everything. Sarah's case also changed how many people viewed missing person investigations. It reminded communities that every disappearance matters. Every person matters. Every family deserves answers. Because behind every headline is a life interrupted, a future that never happened, a story that deserves to be told. Sarah was not remembered because she became part of a famous investigation. She was remembered because she was loved. That was the message her family wanted people to understand. The case was never only about finding the person responsible. It was about honoring the person who was lost. Years after the verdict, memorials continued. People gathered to remember Sarah. They spoke about her life. They shared stories. They kept her name connected to kindness rather than tragedy. Because the final victory was not only that justice was served. The final victory was that Sarah was no longer defined by the mystery surrounding her disappearance. She became remembered for who she was. A daughter, a friend, a person whose life mattered. And yet, even after all those years, the story carried one final haunting thought. Somewhere in the evidence room, before the breakthrough came, the answer had already existed. The truth was there, waiting, silent, invisible. The world simply was not ready to hear it yet. And that is what makes cold cases so powerful. They are not always stories about things that disappeared. Sometimes they are stories about things that stayed hidden, waiting for the exact moment when someone finally knows where to look. For Sarah Whitmore, that moment arrived nearly 40 years later. A moment that proved no amount of time could completely bury the truth. No distance could erase what happened. And no secret could remain hidden forever. The years after Sarah Whitmore's case was solved became a period of reflection for everyone connected to the investigation. The headlines eventually disappeared. The television cameras moved away. The courtroom doors closed. But the impact of the case continued, because some stories do not end when the verdict is announced. Some stories continue through the people left behind, through the lessons learned, through the memories that refuse to disappear. Sarah's case became more than a solved crime. It became a reminder of the power of persistence, a reminder that victims are never just names in old reports, and a reminder that justice sometimes takes a path nobody expects. When investigators looked back at the original case, they discovered something remarkable. The answers had always been closer than anyone realized. Not obvious, not easy, but present. The evidence existed. The records existed. The connections existed. The challenge was understanding how they all fit together. That is the nature of cold cases. They are puzzles created by time. Pieces become separated. Details lose their meaning. People forget conversations. Places change. But somewhere inside that confusion, the truth often remains. The detectives who reopened Sarah's case understood that they were not starting from zero. They were continuing a story that began decades earlier. They carefully studied everything, every report, every photograph, every interview. every piece of evidence. They approached the investigation with a different perspective, not asking what had already been tried, but asking what had not yet been discovered. That question changed everything, because sometimes solving an old mystery requires looking at familiar information in a completely new way. The same evidence can tell a different story when examined through different eyes. In 1985, the evidence could only reveal what investigators had the ability to discover. Decades later, it revealed something much more: a connection, a name, a path toward justice. For Sarah's family, watching the case unfold again after so many years was an emotional experience. They had spent decades learning how to live without answers. Then suddenly, answers arrived all at once. There was no gradual preparation, no easy transition. One day, the case was still an unanswered mystery. The next day, investigators had identified the person responsible. That kind of change can feel overwhelming. For families of cold case victims, justice often arrives with conflicting emotions: relief, anger, sadness, peace, all at the same time. They are relieved because the truth is finally known. They are angry because it took so long. They are sad because no verdict can undo the past. And they search for peace because they have spent years carrying a burden they never chose. Sarah's family understood that the conviction was important, but they also understood that the real tragedy was that Sarah's future had been stolen. There were years she should have lived, places she should have visited, memories she should have created, people she should have met. A conviction could acknowledge what happened, but it could never restore what was lost. That reality is what makes cold cases so painful. The solution can arrive, but time cannot be returned. The investigation also changed the way many people viewed DNA evidence. Before cases like Sarah's, many people thought of DNA only as a scientific tool, something used in laboratories, something connected to crime shows and television. But real investigations showed something much more powerful. DNA could become a bridge between generations, a connection between the past and the present, a way for evidence collected decades earlier to communicate with investigators today. In Sarah's case, DNA became the link between a forgotten moment in 1985 and a courtroom nearly 40 years later. It connected a victim who could no longer speak with investigators who refused to stop listening. That was the true power of the evidence. It gave Sarah a voice. The investigation also raised difficult questions about the years before the arrest. People wonder how Mercer had lived with the secret, how someone could wake up every morning, go to work, talk with neighbors, build relationships, knowing that the past could eventually return. Investigators often say that one of the most disturbing aspects of cold cases is not only finding the suspect, it is realizing how long someone may have carried the truth. A person can create an entire life around a hidden moment. They can convince themselves that time has protected them. They can believe that because nobody came looking today, nobody ever will. But the world continues changing. Technology advances. Investigations evolve. And the things people believe are forgotten can suddenly become the most important things of all. Sarah's case became an example of that reality. The suspect did not escape. He waited, and eventually time caught up. Across Ohio, law enforcement agencies reviewed their own unsolved cases after seeing the outcome. Old files were reopened. Evidence was examined again. Investigators searched for possibilities that may have been impossible years earlier, because Sarah's case proved one important fact. A cold case is not necessarily a closed case. It may simply be a case waiting for the right moment. The story also reached people outside Ohio. Families across the country who were still searching for missing loved ones saw something they desperately needed: hope. They saw that decades did not automatically mean the truth was gone. They saw that technology could change everything. They saw that someone, somewhere, might still be working to find answers. For investigators, that became one of the most meaningful parts of the case. Not just solving one crime, but showing others that their own cases might still have possibilities. The phrase "cold case solved" became more than a headline. It became proof that unanswered questions can still have answers, that silence can still be broken, that justice can still arrive, even when many people have stopped believing it will. But the most important part of Sarah's story remained the same. Before she was a cold case, before she was a headline, before her name appeared in news reports across the country, she was a person, someone with dreams, someone with people who loved her, someone whose life mattered. And after decades of searching, the world finally understood the full weight of that truth. Sarah Whitmore was not just a mystery that was solved. She was a reminder that every victim deserves to be remembered, every family deserves answers, and every piece of evidence deserves a chance to tell its story. Because sometimes the smallest trace can carry the biggest truth, and sometimes, after decades of darkness, one discovery is enough to bring everything back into the light. The story of Sarah Whitmore's case continued to echo long after the courtroom had gone quiet, because the most powerful cold cases are not remembered only because of the crime itself. They are remembered because of what they reveal about time, about justice, about the human need for answers. For nearly 40 years, Sarah's disappearance represented uncertainty, a question without an ending, a chapter that remained open while the world continued moving forward. But when the truth finally emerged, it changed the way people understood the case. The mystery was no longer about whether Sarah would ever receive justice. It became a story about how justice survived, how evidence survived, how hope survived. The investigation became a lesson studied by law enforcement officials who wanted to understand how an old case could be transformed into a successful prosecution. They examined every stage, from the original response in 1985 to the preservation of evidence, to the modern forensic analysis that eventually uncovered the truth. The conclusion was clear. Cold cases are often solved because someone believes they are still worth solving. Without that belief, evidence can remain silent forever. That was the difference in Sarah's case. Someone decided to look again. Someone decided the old files were not just forgotten documents. They were pieces of a story waiting to be completed. The detectives who reopened the investigation understood that they were carrying the responsibility of those who came before them. The original investigators had searched. They had followed leads. They had interviewed people. They had done everything possible with the tools available at the time. The new investigators were not correcting the past. They were continuing it. They were taking the unfinished work of another generation and moving it forward. That connection between investigators, separated by decades, became one of the most meaningful parts of the case. A detective in 1985 collected evidence without knowing how important it would become. A detective decades later examined that same evidence and found the answer. 2 different eras, 2 different worlds. One shared goal, justice for Sarah. The community also changed after the case was solved. The fear that once surrounded the story slowly transformed into remembrance. People no longer gathered to discuss what might have happened. They gathered to remember who Sarah was. That change mattered, because for decades, the mystery had overshadowed the person. The unanswered questions became louder than the life she lived. But once the truth was known, the focus returned to Sarah. Her personality, her kindness, the people she helped, the moments that made her unique. Friends shared stories that had been kept alive through the years. Small memories, simple moments, things that may seem ordinary but become priceless when someone is gone. The way she laughed, the way she spoke, the way she made people feel important. Those memories became the most important part of her legacy. Not the crime, not the investigation, not the years of uncertainty. Sarah herself. That was what her family wanted people to understand. A victim is always more than the tragedy that happened to them. Behind every cold case headline is a human story, a life interrupted, a family changed forever, a future that was never allowed to happen. The case also reminded people of something uncomfortable, that evil does not always look obvious. The person responsible was not someone who appeared dangerous to everyone around him. He was someone who existed quietly, someone who moved through ordinary life, someone who avoided attention. That reality disturbed many people because it challenged their understanding of what a criminal looks like. People often imagine danger as something visible, something easy to recognize. But sometimes danger hides behind normal appearances. Sometimes the person who creates the greatest damage is someone nobody expects, not only because of what happened, but because of how long the truth remained hidden. The investigation also created new conversations about the importance of preserving evidence. Across police departments, officials emphasize that old evidence should never be dismissed simply because a case has gone cold. A piece of evidence collected today may have limited value, but tomorrow's technology may reveal something impossible to discover now. Science continues advancing. Methods improve. New tools appear. What seems ordinary today may become the key to solving a mystery decades later. Sarah's case became proof of that idea. The evidence that solved the crime was not new. The understanding was new. That difference changed everything. For families still waiting for answers, the case carried a powerful message. Do not assume silence means nothing is happening. Do not assume an unanswered question will remain unanswered forever, because somewhere there may still be a person searching. Somewhere there may still be evidence waiting. Somewhere there may still be a breakthrough that has not happened yet. The phrase cold case solved became connected with hope. Not false hope, not promises, but the possibility that the impossible can change. The possibility that time does not always win. Years after the conviction, Sarah's name continued to appear whenever investigators discussed the importance of modern forensic science. Her case became an example of patience, a reminder that justice is sometimes delayed not because people stop caring, but because the tools needed to uncover the truth have not arrived yet. The world of 1985 could not solve Sarah's case. The world decades later could. That difference represented the incredible progress of science, but it also represented something more personal. It represented the determination of people who refused to let Sarah become just another forgotten story. Because every unsolved case creates a danger. The danger that a person becomes reduced to a file number, a date, a photograph, a headline. But Sarah's case avoided that fate. People continued saying her name. They continued telling her story. They continued searching. And because of that, decades later, the truth finally emerged. The investigation had begun with a disappearance. It ended with discovery. It began with silence. It ended with a voice created by evidence, a voice carried through time, a voice that proved one undeniable truth. No matter how long someone hides, no matter how many years pass, no matter how deeply the past is buried, the truth can still return. The years following the resolution of Sarah Whitmore's case created a strange contrast. The investigation was over. The suspect had been identified. The courtroom had delivered its decision. But the emotional impact of the case continued to live on, because some crimes do not end when the legal process ends. They remain part of the history of a community. They remain part of the memories of families. They remain part of the lessons passed from one generation to another. Sarah's case became one of those stories. A story that began with uncertainty and fear. A story that survived decades of silence. A story that proved the past can return when people least expect it. For the investigators who solved the case, the final outcome brought a sense of responsibility fulfilled. But they also knew something important. Solving the case did not mean everything was fixed. There was no way to restore the years Sarah's family lost. There was no way to erase the pain of waiting. There was no way to undo the moment when Sarah's life was taken away. Justice could acknowledge the truth, but it could not rewrite history. That reality is what makes cold cases so emotionally powerful. They are not only about finding answers. They are about understanding what those answers mean. A solved case can bring relief, but it can also bring sadness, because every answer reminds people why they were searching in the first place. Sarah's story remained connected to a painful truth. Someone who was deeply loved was gone, and no amount of time could change that. The investigation also changed the way people viewed the importance of memory. For decades, Sarah existed in the minds of those who knew her through stories, photographs, small moments, details that others might overlook. A favorite place, a familiar smile, a simple conversation. Those memories became a bridge between the past and the present. They kept Sarah from becoming only a crime story, because without those memories, a victim can become reduced to the worst moment of their life. But Sarah was more than the night she disappeared. She was the years before that night. She was the people she touched. She was the future she should have had. That became the message repeated by her family. Remember the person, not only the case. The investigation also created discussions about the future of unsolved crimes. Law enforcement agencies began looking differently at old evidence. They began asking new questions. What if the answer was already there? What if the evidence had simply not been understood yet? What if another cold case could be solved the same way? Those questions changed how detectives approach forgotten investigations. They no longer saw old files as unfinished failures. They saw them as opportunities. Every box in an evidence room represented a possibility. Every report represented information. Every name represented a connection that might still matter. Sarah's case became proof that patience could change everything. The breakthrough did not come because investigators discovered something dramatic hidden in plain sight. It came because they were willing to examine something everyone had already seen. The difference was perspective. The evidence had not changed. The technology had. That idea fascinated many people because it showed that the future can sometimes solve the past. A person living in 1985 could never have imagined the tools available decades later. The investigators searching for Sarah at the time could not have known what science would eventually make possible. But the evidence remained, waiting for the right moment, waiting for the right questions, waiting for someone to understand its meaning. The case also left a lasting impression on younger detectives. Many entered law enforcement because of stories like Sarah's, stories where persistence mattered, stories where victims were not forgotten, stories where justice could still arrive even after years of uncertainty. They learned that investigations are not always measured in days or months. Sometimes they are measured in decades, and the people who continue searching during those decades carry a special responsibility. They carry the hopes of families who have been waiting. They carry the memories of victims who cannot speak. They carry the belief that every story deserves an ending. Sarah's case became a symbol of that belief, but it also became a warning that some people can hide for a very long time. They can create ordinary lives. They can convince others that nothing happened. They can believe that distance and time will protect them. But they cannot control the future. They cannot control science. They cannot control the evidence left behind. And they cannot erase the truth forever. The arrest of Daniel Mercer showed that justice does not always arrive when people expect. Sometimes it arrives after everyone has stopped waiting. Sometimes it arrives after the world has changed completely. Sometimes it arrives when the person responsible has spent years believing they succeeded. That was the most shocking part of Sarah's case. The belief that someone could escape. The belief that decades could erase consequences. The belief that silence could last forever. But silence is not the same as disappearance. A secret hidden for years is still a secret. A crime ignored by time is still a crime. And evidence waiting in the dark can still bring the truth into the light. As the years passed, Sarah's story became connected with a larger conversation about justice, about the victims who are still waiting, about families who still search, about investigators who continue working when there are no headlines and no guarantees. Because behind every cold case is someone who deserves to be remembered, someone whose story matters, someone whose family still hopes. Sarah's case showed that hope can survive longer than anyone expects. Nearly 40 years separated the crime from the answer, a lifetime for some people, an entire generation. But the truth remained, and when the moment finally arrived, everything changed. The case that once represented uncertainty became an example of possibility. The investigation that once seemed forgotten became a reminder. The evidence that once seemed ordinary became the key. And the woman whose name had been connected to mystery for decades finally received what everyone had been searching for. The truth, not a rumor, not a theory, not another unanswered question. The truth. And that truth will remain one of the most powerful reminders from Ohio's darkest cold case. Time may slow justice. Time may challenge investigators. Time may create distance. But time does not have the final word. The evidence does. The truth does. And eventually, the truth finds a way to be heard. For decades, the story of Sarah Whitmore remained unfinished. A name connected to a mystery. A photograph connected to unanswered questions. A family connected to a pain that never truly disappeared. But after nearly 40 years, the silence was finally broken. The evidence had been examined. The investigation had been completed. The courtroom had delivered its judgment. And the cold case that once seemed destined to remain unsolved had finally reached its final chapter. But the true ending of Sarah's story was never only about an arrest. It was never only about a conviction. The real ending was about remembering. Remembering that behind every investigation is a person. Behind every piece of evidence is a moment. Behind every headline is a family waiting for answers. Sarah Whitmore's story became a reminder that victims should never disappear twice. First from the world, and then from memory. For many years, the biggest fear surrounding Sarah's case was that the truth would never be discovered, that the person responsible would live forever without consequences, that her name would eventually become just another forgotten entry in an old investigation file. But that did not happen, because people continued searching, because evidence was preserved, because technology continued advancing, because someone believed that an old mystery was still worth solving. That belief changed everything. The final resolution of the case became a message heard far beyond Ohio, a message for families who still waited, for investigators who still searched, for communities still haunted by unanswered questions. The message was simple. Never assume the story is over. A case can become cold, but a victim does not become forgotten. The passage of time may change the investigation. It may change the people involved. It may change the world around the case. But it does not erase what happened. It does not erase the evidence. And it does not erase the need for justice. Sarah's case also reveals something deeply unsettling about the human ability to hide. For nearly 40 years, Daniel Mercer lived a life that appeared ordinary. That reality shocked many people, because they wanted to believe that someone capable of such a crime would always look different. They wanted to believe there would be obvious signs, a warning, a clue, something that would make the truth visible. But life is rarely that simple. Sometimes the darkest secrets exist behind normal appearances. Sometimes the person everyone overlooks is the person carrying the greatest secret. That was one of the hardest lessons from Sarah's case. The truth is not always obvious. Sometimes it waits. Sometimes it hides. Sometimes it requires decades before the world has the ability to uncover it. The evidence that solved Sarah's case represented more than science. It represented patience. It represented the connection between generations of investigators. It represented the promise that victims would not be abandoned. The detective who first worked the case in 1985 could not have known what the future would bring. The investigators who solved it decades later could not change what happened. But together, they completed the same mission, finding the truth, giving Sarah a voice, bringing answers to a family that had waited too long. The story also changed how people look at the phrase cold case. For many, those words once suggested something impossible, a mystery without an ending, a question that would never be answered. But Sarah's case proved something different. A cold case is not always a dead end. Sometimes it is simply a case waiting for the right moment, waiting for better technology, waiting for new investigators, waiting for someone willing to look again. That is why Sarah's story continued to matter, because somewhere another family was still waiting. Somewhere another evidence box was still sitting on a shelf. Somewhere another mystery was still waiting for its chance. And the hope created by Sarah's case belonged to all of them. The town where Sarah disappeared changed over the years. New buildings appeared. Old places disappeared. New generations grew up. Many people who knew Sarah personally were no longer there. But her story remained. Not because of the crime. Because of the impact. Because people remembered. Because people refused to let time erase her. That may have been the greatest victory of all. Not simply finding the person responsible, but making sure Sarah's life mattered. Making sure the world remembered the person before the case. The woman before the headline. The life before the loss. And as the years continue to pass, Sarah Whitmore's case remains a powerful reminder of one undeniable truth. The past is never truly gone. It leaves traces, in evidence, in memories, in the people who refuse to forget. For decades, the answer to Sarah's disappearance was hidden. But hidden is not the same as lost. The truth was always there, waiting beneath layers of time, waiting beneath years of uncertainty, waiting for the moment when someone would finally uncover it. And when that moment arrived, an entire community watched as a mystery that had lasted almost a lifetime finally came to an end. A cold case solved. A decades-old mystery finally answered. A family finally given the truth they had spent years searching for. The story of Sarah Whitmore will always carry sadness, because justice cannot bring back the years that were taken. It cannot erase the pain. It cannot change the past. But it can do something important. It can acknowledge the truth. It can honor the victim. It can remind the world that no one should ever be forgotten. And perhaps that is the most powerful lesson left behind by this case. No matter how much time passes, no matter how far the world moves forward, no matter how deeply someone tries to bury the truth has a way of returning. Sometimes through a witness, sometimes through a forgotten detail, sometimes through a tiny piece of evidence waiting silently for decades, and sometimes after years of darkness, the smallest discovery becomes a light that finally reveals everything. For Sarah Whitmore, that light arrived nearly 40 years later. But it arrived, and after decades of questions, the silence was finally replaced by the one thing everyone had been searching for, the truth.